I am the most superfluous part of this entire event. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm the Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. I run our Foreign Policy Department, but I have nothing to do with this extremely timely and important event, which is being hosted by one of our economics scholars, Stan Voiger, who has a particular personal interest in the goings-on in the Netherlands, and has very graciously agreed to lead a discussion today on whether the elections in Holland are going to be the end of the wave of populism that has hit Europe, or whether it is in fact just more of the same. The exit polls are coming out. They're not even paying attention to you or to me. They're all looking at the screen, and it looks like Geert Wilders is just not doing as well as people thought. And guess what? I have no idea what to say about that. That's why they're here. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to all of our panelists. Stan is going to introduce you. They are all each in their own way going to bring something particularly fascinating to the conversation. But Stan is going to give you everybody's more fuller bio. So with that, thank you, and over to you, Stan.
All right, thank you very much, Danny. I want to do it from here. I think soon slides will pop up there on the right. I'm going to talk very briefly. I think most of you are reasonably familiar with the Dutch electoral system and the elections as they unfold, but I want to be fair and give a very brief introduction. The Netherlands has straight up proportional representation, 150 seats in the lower chamber of the States General. You have to form a majority there. Typically, that involves multiple parties. The entire country is one electoral district, and currently seats are distributed as. Okay, can you put the slides up? As you see there. So these are the results of the most recent elections. 2012, you'll see two large parties: the VVD, which is the sort of center-right classical liberal party, and the PVDA, which is the Labour Party. They are currently in a coalition together. They run the country. You'll see on the right that they together have 21 seats in the Senate, which is not a majority, so they rely on support from a number of other parties there. The Senate is important in that to be able to pass legislation, you need a majority there as well. But the Senate is elected by provincial legislatures that are not being picked today. So the Senate, this composition of the Senate is going to be the way it looks like there, right? So in any coalition, and we'll talk about potential coalitions during our conversation, any coalition is going to have to take the dynamics there into account as well. Now, these are the results from the most recent elections, but as 5 years went by, a bunch of guys quit their party and became independent members of the parliament, as you see in the new distribution of seats there on the left, where there are 8 independent members. Some of them came from the Labour Party, in particular 2 Turkish Dutch members who decided to start their own quasi-Turkish nationalist party. We can talk about that a little later. And then the VVD typically spins off anti-Islamic, anti-immigration members and parties, including about 15 years ago, Geert Wilders himself, who used to be a member of parliament for the VVD and now runs his own PVV. Now, let's skip to the 4th slide, which is, let's skip that one. That slide showed the most recent poll, but we have an exit poll now, which I think is showing for you right now. What we see there is big losses for the 2 parties that were governing together, in particular for the Labour Party. And we see that the VVD remains the largest party, but loses about 10 seats. The PVDA, which is the Labour Party, has lost a significant chunk of its seats. And there are 3 parties that all poll at 19 seats there, which is Wilders' PVV. That's a little lower than polls suggested. The Christian Democrats have made somewhat of a comeback. And the Green Left has gone from 4 to 19 seats, I think, if I'm 16.
16.
16. So that's a big jump. B66 also doing pretty well. And so with that, I'm going to let you ponder the results a little bit. With that, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to give them all the chance to deliver some opening remarks. And after that, we're going to have what I hope will be a group conversation while we have a live feed of Dutch TV in the background with results coming in as we talk. Obviously, this level of technological sophistication will almost guarantees a certain level of improvisation as well. So please bear with us as we try to make this happen. But now, without further ado, let's turn to our panelists. I'm going to first ask Frank Heemskerk to speak. Frank is a former member of parliament, former cabinet member, Minister of Foreign Trade, and a member of the PvdA, the Labour Party. So Frank is in a particularly good mood today. He is now at the World Bank, but is speaking here in his role as a social democrat from Kansas, where Frank went to high school. After that, we're going to turn to Ambassador Tim Broas, who is the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands until just a few months ago. He will discuss how this campaign went, what the current state of affairs in the Netherlands is, as he is, among all of us, probably closest to things as they go on. Now, after that, we will try to move away from this kind of inside baseball a little bit, and I'm going to ask Yasha Maunk, a political scientist, German Marshall Fund affiliate, New America affiliate, Harvard lecturer, and regular columnist, to speak a little bit about something that we may not have seen today, a move toward more illiberal democracy, and how he sees today's results fit into the broader European or even Western picture. Then last but not least, I will ask Professor Kate McNamara of Georgetown at American University this year to discuss how she sees these developments in the Netherlands fit into the broader politics of the EU and the Eurozone. And with that, Frank, take it away.
Okay, thank you. It's not a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not a great afternoon, but I would like to show you something, and that's the ballot. That's the Dutch ballot, and it's 28 parties, from the Pirate Party to the Vote No Party or Don't Vote Party, to the Party for the Animals, to the Labour Party, to Geert Wilders Party for the Freedom, and in a sense that's a celebration for democracy, and that's my first comment is that. The quality of the discussions of the Dutch elections were great. People voted with their passion, and there was a rich variety of parties, and I think that's a very good thing. Second, also for the international audience, there was a lot of attention to Geert Wilders. He will not be in the next government, is my prediction. He doesn't have the 76 seats. Remember that number, 76. It's crucial. Why doesn't he be in the next government? Because the other parties don't share his values, or they don't trust him, or they don't agree with his solutions. So, he's being isolated, and he did less well than expected. So I think that's important conclusion number 2. Conclusion number 3 is that I expect we will have in the Netherlands a center-right coalition with left elements. So it will be, and it will be 4 parties, because we need the 76 seats. And the VVD, together with 2 others, doesn't reach 76. So such a combination, center-right with left elements, is extremely difficult. So it will take, my prediction is it will take months before we will have a new government. Although also there in Belgium, I think it took 2 years when they had a new government, and they had an economic boom. So
Frank, could you briefly address how the bargaining process unfolds?
Yeah, I will say something on the bargaining process because it's, for example, very important who will be the number 2 in the electoral vote, because that will be a dominant player in the new cabinet, and 3 parties are now at 19. Then 4, and that's also something, for an international perspective, that's how do older people behave in an aging society in their voting behavior. And for me, it's a disappointment that a lot of older people in the Netherlands don't vote what is best for their children and for their grandchildren, but they vote for their own wallet. If you look to 50 plus, they have 4 seats in parliament. I think it's shocking that they only want their own retirement age to be reduced and the retirement benefits to go up. I think that's not healthy. I mean, you should invest also in the future and children, but a lot of people voted out of self-interest. Fifth conclusion, and that's a difficult one, but that's if you look to the 2 ruling parties, VVD and PvdA, I think they did a good job over the past 4 years. I think we had a lot of reforms. I think there was a lot of recognition for these 2 parties, but both of them have been crushed in the elections. VVD lost 10 seats, and my own party, PvdA, 38 back to 9. Well, that's a disaster. And that also means that there is not a lot of incentive for statesmanship, for leadership, to, let's say, to do what is well for the country. That's one explanation. Another explanation could be that people do give recognition for the fact that you've done a good job, but you don't get the vote automatically out of that. There's no longer, let's say, the historical loyalty. There's a lot of recognition for what Obama did, but still a lot of people didn't vote Democratic in the US. So my conclusion from an international perspective, I think it's a relatively positive outcome, these Dutch results. Of course, there was a populist voice and a populist vote, but I expect a broad coalition of 4 parties, also progressive parties on the Green, D66, they did really, really, really well. So there's no Nexit, not the Dutch exit out of the euro, no Wilders. It will take a while before we'll have a new government. And as a Labour politician, this is not the best day ever.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Broers, what do you think? How do we get to this?
Just a few comments on the atmosphere, the political scene in the Netherlands these days, and the campaign. And Frank summed it up, I think, very well in terms of where we are and what happened today, and where we're going. The main issue, I think that Mr. Wilders picked up a lot of support over the last 8 months from Brexit and from Trump. And I think the reason the polls were so strong in his favor until literally the last week was because of that. He had a huge tailwind from Brexit and Trump. And so a lot of people were thinking, yeah, we're going to leave the EU too. We're going to be next. And Wilders was our vehicle to do that. And to his credit, Mr. Rutte and also Mr. Buma, they realized that this was happening, and they very, very smartly went out and said things like to the immigrants, if you can't integrate into Dutch society, then leave. Now, a lot of people are offended by that and don't think that Rutte or Buma should be saying things like that. And even Lodewijk Asscher, the leader of PvdA, Frank's party, came out and said things not quite like that, but pretty strong.
Buma being the leader of the Christian Democrats.
CDA, yes. Yeah. Buma is the leader of CDA, and Rutte is VVD, and of course Asscher is PvdA. So they moved a lot of people. People said, well, Rutte's done a pretty good job as prime minister, and if he's going to say things like that and tell the immigrants that they've got to integrate and they've got to, join the Dutch society and adhere to our customs and our values, or leave, then maybe we can live with Rutte for another 4 years or 6 years. So I think Rutte very smartly took that position, whether you agree with him or not, and politically, or whether you agree with his statement about either conform or leave. I think it was wise, and I think that's the reason that VVD just got 31 seats. Frank is right, that's a big drop from where they were last time, but still, people were predicting that they might get in the low 20s, and they got 31, which I think is significant. And I believe that it was his change and his statements to the immigrants that caused his numbers to improve. CDA, same thing. I think Mr. Buma and CDA decided that they could move over a little bit to the right and make statements like that, and that succeeded as well. And they've got 19 seats. The PvdA, I think, again, as Frank said, they've had a horrible result, and this was also predicted. The Labour Party has been declining for well over a year, and a lot of people are disappointed with the Labour Party and the governing that they did with the VVD. But I agree with Frank. I thought, as a coalition, I thought they did a great job together. So it's very disappointing to see, because it's a great party. The PVD is a great party. And I think the difficulty in forming the coalition is going to be, getting to 76 is going to be the number one challenge, but number two is, will a party like the Greens, will they want to be in a coalition with these center to right parties and face the same risks that PVDF faced? Yeah. And so I think that's going to be the challenge, and I think it's going to take a long time to form this coalition, because these parties have to decide, do they want to be part of a coalition that leans to the right and has leadership that's saying to the immigrants, hey, either conform or get out? And I'm not sure the Socialist Party or the Greens or even Day 66, I'm not sure they're going to want to be part of that coalition. So it's going to be a challenge to put this coalition together. I think the Dutch will be able to do it. I don't think we'll have a Belgium or a Spain situation where this just lingers on without a government. I think they will put it together, but I think there's going to be some real introspection and real thinking on the part of some of these parties that are going to have to provide the seats that get to 76. Just one last comment. I think immigration was the main issue in this campaign, but it was more migration than immigration. I think that Mr. Wilders speaks to the Moroccans and to the Turks, but I think the voters were most concerned with the new immigrants, the new refugees who are coming in. That was their main concern. They, I think, have assimilated with the Moroccans and Turks who have been there now for generations, notwithstanding what Mr. Wilders says about them. But I think the biggest concern that I saw when I was there was the refugees who are coming in, and whether they're going to be allowed to stay, whether there's any criminal elements or terrorist elements in these groups, whether they're going to be getting benefits from the Dutch government. Because the Dutch, let's face it, it's a socialist welfare state, and people really treasure their benefits. And so that's something I think people were most concerned about.
Thank you very much. One note on that coalition of four parties, I think, has 37 seats in the Senate, so they would need a fifth party to support them on some sort of quasi-regular basis, I think.
37, oh, you mean 38, yes.
In the Senate, yeah. That's right.
We'll see how it goes. Yasha, what do you think? Is the center holding? And is liberal democracy going to be with us forever now?
The Netherlands have ridden to the rescue of everything. Let me preface this by saying that when I started teaching in graduate school, I thought that I needed to find, you have to find a class in which you're going to be a TA or TF. And I thought, well, I better find a class that I know a lot about, because how am I going to teach this unless I'm a real expert on the subject? And then I realized very quickly that most people chose things to teach not because they knew something about it, but because they wanted to learn about it. So in that sense, graduate school has prepared me extremely well for this panel. Since I think a lot about populist politics in Europe, but I have no special expertise in the Netherlands. But I do think that there's a number of things that I see really as a sort of dilettante outside observer that fit into a larger pattern of what's going on in Europe. And I just want to draw out some of those themes from the election results to sort of wider trends in Europe. The first is that I want to actually disagree with the ambassador. I don't think that Brexit, and especially Trump, is a help to populists in Europe. I think that sort of it should update our Bayesian expectations of how well populists can do. I think it should be a huge warning about the fact that we can be complacent about the success of populists and think they'll never get a majority, and under the right circumstances they can. But I don't think that it's directly a help to populists in Europe. And I think that populists, including Geert Wilders, have made a huge mistake in allying themselves with Donald Trump specifically. Because it's one thing to have a sociological analysis where you're saying the kinds of people in the Netherlands who might vote for Wilders are similar to the kinds of people in the United States who might vote for Trump. I think that's clearly true. But just because you like your own populist doesn't mean you like your neighbor's populist. It's crazy for Marine Le Pen to think, look, I'm sort of a little bit like Trump in certain structural ways, So all of these French people who are deeply nationalist and xenophobic are going to love me if I align myself with Donald Trump. The French populist voter dislikes Donald Trump. And so I think it's a huge strategic mistake of Marine Le Pen to align himself with Donald Trump. So that's one thought. The other thought that I think is the clear overarching thought is that Steinrocken and Martin Lipset in the early 60s observed that the European party systems had frozen. That after a period of real instability and change, there now was a pretty set party system and that it wouldn't change. And they were right for 45 or so years. You saw the rise of the Green parties a little bit in the 80s. You saw some new entrants, but by and large, in most European countries, when you go back to, say, 2005, the party political system looks strikingly similar to 1965. Well, if you compare 2005 to today, it doesn't look so similar, right? And this is something that you see everywhere across Europe. Yeah. We are in a new world, not necessarily that the populists will always win, but definitely in that you have huge fluidity, that voters are no longer as loyal as they used to be, that parties can crash and be reborn perhaps one day, and mutate. And that is a slightly scary new world, but it's also a world that has opportunities in some ways for more political dynamism and so on. The third element of that is that the set of parties that have so far done the least well from that is the social democratic parties. That is clearly true in this election in the Netherlands. I mean, the kind of radical crash you see in the support for the social democratic party there is dramatic. But it's not so dissimilar to what you would likely get if you had an election in Great Britain soon, what you've already seen in Scotland. It's not so dissimilar to what you see reflected in polls in a lot of different countries. The German Social Democratic Party at the moment has a sort of slightly artificial boom. But when you look at the polling average over the last 5-6 years, it has been at about 20%, when historically it's been at around 40%. So you see social democratic parties being particularly challenged by that, and that's going to redefine what the left looks like. The last thing I want to say, or perhaps a penultimate thing, is that I think that the structural drivers of this populism is real. When you look over a 30-40 year period, you see both far-left populist parties and far-right populist parties rising. They used to have a combined vote share on average of something like 5 or 6% in the 60s. Now they have a combined vote share of 25% across Europe, and obviously there's some countries in the higher. And we have to think seriously about what is driving that. My personal theory is that there's a bunch of factors: economic anxiety, urban-rural split, a sort of rebellion against multi-ethnic democracy of a certain sort among a portion of the population, and the rise of social media. Other people have slightly different theories, but there's definitely structural drivers of this, and we have to tackle those structural drivers, and that's the only way that we can confront this in the long term. My ultimate point, my last point is, in the short term, good political leadership can keep the vote together. It's not going to be what saves us in the long run, because you're not going to have good political leadership at every turn. And you see what happens when the structural preconditions come together with bad political leadership and a bad political campaign. Well, you get something like Donald Trump, right? So you can't rely on good political leadership because it's just not always going to be there. But certainly you can deliver that good political leadership in the short run. You emphasized this tactical strategic move by some Dutch politicians to the right. I think just as important was the amazing manufactured confrontation between the Netherlands and Turkey in the last couple of days. Mm-hmm. Why is Rutte at 50% more than the opinion polls had predicted? I don't know Dutch politics, let me repeat that, but it seems to me that obviously the fact that he got to stand up to a foreign power that just so happens to be allied with a lot of the migrants in Turkey, right, and say, not with us, in a way that, by the way, was not wrong on principle. I mean, you can have a debate one way or the other, but it certainly wasn't illiberal in the sort of way in which Wilders' party is. There was a political opportunity, I would argue, manufactured and exploited in a smart way, and hats off to him for that.
That clearly helped.
Yeah.
I agree.
Erdogan won 3 seats as well, by the way.
So, and this, by the way, so I'm as somebody who now writes a weekly column, I'm now the bane of my existence is what do I write about. I think that's what I'm going to look into after this, because I wasn't aware of this party before today. And that is the big dog that hasn't barked in European politics. There are no ethnic immigrant nationalist parties. There are certain parties of historical minorities. So say in the north of Germany, there's a Danish party, right? There's those kinds of things. There are no ethnic migrant parties. If you start getting that in European politics, it's one more step towards the thawing of a party system, and it would, I think, create a pretty dangerous and ugly dynamic.
Professor McNamara.
Right, okay. So I agree with, I think, everything my colleagues have said, and particularly Yasha kind of went over some of the train that I was going to go over, so I'll maybe just highlight a few things and then kind of shift and talk a little bit more about the EU as a frame for all of this. But I do think we are very clearly at a sea change in politics in the West. I think there's just no denying it. We can tell stories about the kind of specifics of the electoral decisions at various points in time, but I think we really need to understand that in terms of the nation state in the West, with the exception, I would argue, of Japan, right? We really are seeing a shift away from the sort of consolidated equilibrium party system of mainstream parties and so on that governed us throughout the post-war era. We really are, I think, at a turning point. In the same way, I think we're at a turning point in terms of the end of the permissive consensus about the European Union. Right? When I started studying the EU almost 20 years ago, I was shocked at how little debate, left-right, there was about the EU, right? That there, in fact, was so little overt contestation, given how deeply the EU actually penetrates down into affecting the everyday lives of people in Europe, right? And the euro is obviously a very dramatic example of that. But, throughout all the different things the EU does, to me it was stunning that this governance system had emerged really without overt democratic contestation about it. Well, those days are over, right? Studying the EU is no longer boring anymore. In fact, it engages overt, real-time politics in ways that are very important. So what are the underlying reasons for this? And I think, again, Yasha really kind of points to some important things. I think there's no denying that political elites and concerned citizens today really do have to grapple with the transition from the industrial economy to the post-industrial economy and the digital economy. And I think this is something that political parties have not grappled well with. I think academics have not grappled well. People like me, political scientists, have not thought hard enough about the ways in which this shift away from manufacturing, the ways in which a shift to sort of precarious work, temporary work, service economy, so on and so forth, is an ill match to the traditional labor, Social Democratic Party, Republican Party, conservative parties, et cetera, on the other side. And I think that those structural changes have created a real opening, right, for the types of populist parties that we see coming to the fore. And I think it's important to think about those big structural changes and how political parties have responded or not, and how unions have responded or not, and so on, but to not think about them and bracket them as only about sort of economic circumstances. And in fact, we need to think about how economic circumstances interact with people's lived experience, with their sense of their own identities, with their social lives, with their everyday lives and the way that they live, and how that actually can translate into the type of identity politics that we're seeing today. I think it's really wrong to sort of pose populist success as either about sort of racist, nationalistic xenophobia, et cetera, versus an economic anxiety argument. I think it's very important that we as scholars and we, again, as concerned citizens and as political leaders think hard about the intertwining of those things and about how something like the European Union, which is by definition a very cosmopolitan enterprise, a very traditionally liberal enterprise in that sense of open borders, of open markets, et cetera, how that really can challenge the felt identities and the social identities of people in this context of these big, broader structural changes away from the post-war economy and the bargains that underpin that. So we can talk more about this in the questions and so on, but let me finish by saying, I'm somebody that thinks the EU on the whole has been an incredibly important and successful project for Europe, bringing it peace and stability and economic dynamism. And so I think it's very laudable in that sense, but I also think the EU has proceeded, again, without building the channels of political contestation and representation and real, true democratic legitimacy that would allow it as what I call a post-national political community, right? A governance system that, again, is not a nation state, but really goes far beyond any kind of international organization you could ever think of. And so we really need to think about how to build in support and build in a sense of democratic representation and European identity to that project for it to work. And so it's very interesting to see these results today, because I think they do give us some breathing room in those of us who support the European projects and so on. But I would also underline this notion that these are big, broad structural changes that simply cannot be ignored and are not going to go away.
I think that's all fair. Can we put on the video live stream behind us? I think that's a more beautiful. We're at the stage now where I think we're ready to be distracted.
There we go. That's right.
From the panel, and we can, make the.
It's already there.
There it is. That's
There we
it.
go.
Can we get it on that one too?
This is
I'm not asking for myself, I have the-
This is the
I have
smartest
the
guy
right
of the
time.
Netherlands. He won a very popular program, TV program. Who's the
Yeah.
smartest guy in the Netherlands? It's
Yeah. So now he gets to be on TV
Yeah.
constantly on all topics.
Junior Minister for Justice.
Yeah. There you go.
Kijkel.
Good
So
shot too.
I wanna keep this reasonably informal, and I'm gonna ask people in the crowd to jump in and ask questions. But first, I wanted to give the panelists the opportunity to respond to each other if there's anything you want to viciously disagree with. If not, there's a couple of things I wanna ask you guys. So first, Frank, I want you to explain just briefly what the process is from now on.
Yeah.
Right, so the results will come in. Presumably, they will be similar to these exit poll results.
Let's hope.
But who knows?
Yeah.
What are the next steps?
Is my mic working or not? Yes. Maybe two things in response. I think the clash between Turkey and the Netherlands was more in the advantage of Erdogan than it was for Rutte. Because in the Netherlands, my explanation is that everybody took the same position as the Prime Minister did. So in that respect, there was not a swing vote. They didn't disagree or agree with Rutte. Everybody thought, this is horrible what's going on and somehow unavoidable. But I think it helps Erdogan with, it's us against them. So that's one.
But didn't it allow Rutte to say, if the populists always paint establishment politicians as people who are not standing up for us, who never have a couch of convictions, who are all talk and no action, it allowed Rutte to say, no, look, here's me standing up for it. There may be political consensus around it, but look at me in a leading role on this, actually walking the walk. Don't you think that might have helped him?
No, because also there, he had full support from the Labour Party. The guy who blocked everything in Rotterdam was a Labour mayor from Moroccan background with 2 passports. So, and it was all over the political spectrum that they said, it's unavoidable, it is wrong what happened, but we stand together in the clash against Turkey. But I do think it helps Erdogan to collect some of the Turkish votes outside of Turkey into his side. Secondly, on the migrant vote, so there are 3 seats now for Denk, which is in English it's think. But that's an newcomers, migrant vote who, let's say, play the card of the us against them. So it is on the rise, and that's interesting. Maybe also there the Netherlands is a leading indicator, as we were a leading indicator also on the debate on Europe. In 2004, the Netherlands voted against the European Constitution, and at that time everybody was in shock. And now everybody thinks, no, this is a new era. Then what's going to go next? Actually, it takes 7 days before the new parliament gets together. And that's the moment when they really, let's say, start taking decision on formal next steps. But as of tonight, texting and willing and dealing is starting behind the scenes. And it's crucial to look to the 76 votes. And so these 4 parties I mentioned could form a coalition, but are there any alternatives? And these alternatives are also important for, let's say, the bargaining power within the, let's say, preferred coalition or not. Because if you could also, let's say, strike a deal, maybe not in the government, but during the government with 76 in another form. So it will be very interesting. It's crucial which party will be number 2, because normally in Dutch politics the number 1 is doing the prime minister, number 2 is the minister of finance. And for example, if CDA and VVD is CDA's number 2, if they have the minister of finance and the VVD has the prime minister, then the financial core of that cabinet will be right wing, which means that it's not very attractive for the progressive and the Green Party to join, and a lot of negotiation has to be going on. So that's so what's going to go next? The party leaders will look to the VVD, because they're the number 1, to come up with a proposal to appoint somebody who has credibility to all parties, to have, let's say, one-on-ones, and to see who wants to talk to who. And then if that's the case, they will appoint somebody else who will really be the negotiator or the facilitator of these negotiations. These negotiations take place behind closed doors. And like Ambassador Broa said, I don't expect a Spanish or Belgium outcome. I do expect it to take a few months, but I don't expect it to take years or another round of elections.
I want to please go ahead.
You mentioned 4 parties. VVD, CDA, Day 66, and who's the 4th?
I expect the Green, because
will that be enough? Will that get us to 76?
They will get it to 76.
Okay.
There are 2 other options which bring you to 76 that might be still with the PvdA, but Labour, but they've been crushed. So I don't think they will go back into government, or with the Socialistic Party, but they're too much on the left, and they have excluded already the VVD, and actually they've lost 1 seat. So I expect the party leader of the Socialistic Party to resign.
Who's gonna? And he'll be succeeded by the previous leader's daughter. Is that the?
No, probably by the.
That's normally how
probably by the
works.
party chairman, who was also on the ballot.
I see. Oh yeah, that's right. I have a quick question for, I guess, all panelists, but especially Professor McNamara. So I think one thing that's clear is that this outcome is not a positive outcome for Eurosceptics, or paint with a broad brush. It's 19 seats for Wilders. I think the Forum for Democracy, which is sort of a pro-Russian, anti-EU party, got 3 seats. That doesn't add up to much.
No.
Do you see in any of the, except from Marine Le Pen aside, do you see any other country that's still within the European Union where you would expect discontent to get to a level where a break with the Union becomes a possibility? Or do you think that this is now a thing of France aside, this is a thing of the past?
I mean, clearly, the UK was in just a completely different category, right? We all of you, I think, know a lot about the EU, and you know that the British were always very reluctant participants in the European Union. And I think one of the sort of paradoxical things maybe for some of these other countries is the countries that may have a lot of illiberalism within them Hungary and so on, are also countries that actually desperately need to stay within the EU for their own economic circumstances, right? So I think there's really a sort of, even though there may be a rhetorical attacks on the EU, from what I understand in terms of the polling and the sort of folks on the ground, in a lot of those countries, it's simply inconceivable that they could step away from the EU, just on economic terms, right?
Sure.
I think there is, of course, a very important question about the role of Russia in all these different EU countries in the Eurosceptic parties, and that's hugely important and needs to be, very seriously dealt with and sort of publicly debated, because that, of course, is unfortunately a trend that goes across the Atlantic as well. But I think, yes, for the moment, I think the EU will remain intact in terms of the 27 at least.
Well, that's good. Yasha, just because you're from Germany, I'm going to ask you this. What do you? I understand these elections are far away. Do you expect but there is this tendency that now after Trump and Brexit, maybe this result will change this a little bit. I've noticed that especially analysts on this side of the Atlantic tend to lump in all different nationalist and populist movements and treat them all as if they now have a 65% shot at winning every election. Can you briefly talk about Alternative for Deutschland and what chances you think they have of becoming a part of any kind of governing coalition? Or
Yeah, I think it's pretty similar to the situation in the Netherlands before today, which is that it's clear that the Alternative for Germany is going to have the best result in its history. That's easy for them to do since the history is very short. But at the last elections, they had a result of 4.9%, which left them 0.1% short of the very sensible threshold you need to get to the Bundestag, which you guys might consider adopting. So the best result in history means that they're going to be in the Bundestag. The polls have fluctuated a little bit. For most of the last year, they've been in the low to mid-teens. Recently, they've been more around 8 or 9%, in part because there's this artificial boom for the Social Democratic Party because Martin Schulz sort of appeared and nobody knows him, and so they love him, and then they'll get to know him, they'll like him less. And some of that is going to go away again, unfortunately. So my point estimate would be that the AfD gets, somewhere between 10 and 15. That's never going to be enough to govern. There's no way that the CDU is going to go into a coalition with them. But it does establish them as a real player in the political system. They have a decent chance of becoming the third biggest party in the country. And that gives them a layup for expanding the role and the voice over the next 4 years. The problem for new populist parties is always leadership. The AfD has semi-solved that and semi-not solved that. They've solved that, and Frauke Petry, I think, unfortunately, is very competent as a party leader and quite charismatic and tactically astute. They haven't solved it in that everybody else in the party hates her. And so there's a chance that they'll put her and sort of go down in a lot of internal infighting. If we're really lucky, that'll happen by September. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think the most likely event is that we'll have a considerable voice in the Bundestag for the next 4 years, and will put themselves in a position to expand that role over the next 4 years.
Excellent. I'm going to use my significant power here to assign myself one last question, and then we're going to turn to the audience. Ambassador Burrows, I wanted to ask you if you could talk to us a little bit about public discourse and political debate in the Netherlands and how it compares to the US, how different the media landscape is, how you think those factors matter. Because I think that's a key. There is still a much more traditional, I think, both discourse and media landscape. So I wanted to see if you think of that.
The media in the Netherlands, as many of you already know, is terrific. They're excellent writers, they're excellent journalists, they cover politics, they cover global affairs very, very well and very intensely. They're all here in the United States. I've talked to many of them since I've been back, and they cover United States politics, United States news, and global news very, very well. So the media coverage, the Volkskrant, the Telegraph, they're all, NRC, they're great newspapers and great television stations. So I've been very impressed with the media over there and the coverage that they give. The big difference is and this is like every country, there's no country like the United States when it comes to running a political campaign. I mean, no country spends the amount of money and does the amount of campaigning that we do. Thank God. But it's extraordinary. But when you're over there and living over there and you realize then they're having a campaign and they're running for office, it's nothing like you're used to seeing here. You don't see billboards, you don't see TV ads, you don't see anything. But they're campaigning. They're out, they're knocking on doors. They're talking to people, they're having town halls, but it's very, very subdued relative to what we're used to here. But it's very effective. And obviously the turnout, and when we were, before we came out, the turnout was 80%. I don't know what it ended up being, but the turnout was huge. And that's virtually unprecedented. So, and it may have been higher than 80%. So the campaigning, the publicity, and everything that these members of parliament did to campaign and run for office, it worked. People got the message. They came out and voted. And the news was out there, the issues were out there, so people were very aware of what the themes were with each of these parties. And I, on the Turkish thing, I agree. I think Rutte, and it may very well be that everybody was in agreement with him, but I think he showed leadership by doing this. And I also agree it was completely manufactured, completely manufactured. I mean, it was telling them the plane that they couldn't land, and then turning this other woman in the car and making her turn around and go back to Germany. It was totally manufactured. But
by who? By Turkey or by the Netherlands?
By the Netherlands.
No, it was manufactured by Turkey.
That's why
it was manufactured by both. It was a complete setup by both. But it worked, and so as a result, I think the VVD did, I think, better than everyone expected. I do think there was a causal link there. But my sense is that politics in the Netherlands is very, very low key. The campaigning is low key. But this time around, because of all the issues on migration, on healthcare, and on Brexit and the EU, I think there was more activity, more turnout, and more interest. So that's...
Excellent. So let's open it up to the room. Meanwhile, our live stream occasionally stops. When it stops on Vlieland and you see a bar chart, those are not national results. That's 400 people voting, so do not get distracted by those by those numbers. So let's take a few questions from the audience. Let's start all the way in the back in the corner. There we go. Wait for the mic. Hold on. Introduce yourself and. Well, we can do both comments and questions. Normally I say make sure you end with a question mark, but today I think even comments are welcome. Yeah.
I'll try. Okay, my name is Jan, I work at the World Bank and I studied in Rotterdam. My question is more towards Europe. Jesse Klaver said he wanted to keep the VVD out of the regering, out of the government. I think we can imagine, or we can assume that the VVD is going to stay in there. However, they are not the most pro-EU parties, at least compared to D66 and the GroenLinks. So my question is now, what does that mean for Europe? And also, if we take maybe a very optimistic case, we have Macron and Schulz, maybe as the next chancellors or presidents of France and Germany. Would that mean that we can actually move ahead and create that slightly more supranational Europe or more democratic Europe that you have been talking about?
So Jesse Klaver is the leader of the Green Left, which did particularly well. I think Frank has very strong views on whether the Green Left will want to join a coalition government with the VVD.
Well, I expect them to join because they've never been in government, and because some of their key politicians of the previous generation would really like to become, I expect them to become cabinet members. Femke Halsema, maybe Kees Vendrik, which means if you're really eager to join, you're not a very good negotiator. So that is a plus and a minus. It's a plus for CDA and VVD. I expect a new government. If that's the new government, it's definitely not an anti-EU government. So for a European perspective, that's a positive thing. I would not expect, based on those 4 or 5, let's say, to hand over more. I don't expect Europe, unfortunately, to become more democratic. I think they will look more about effectiveness and make Europe work on the big things. But there's still a lot of support for sovereignty, I think, across the parties in the Netherlands.
All right, let's go to your next door neighbor.
Can I take a shot at that? Great, because I think it raises a lot of really important questions. I mean, there is this, really important tension between my kind of arguments about the need for more democracy at the European level and the desires of national politicians to, of course, hold on to their sovereign democracy, right? And to think about how to shift to have, it's sort of, in a way, a zero-sum sort of story, right? And a sense that actually national politicians would therefore be less important. I would like to believe that there's a way out of that, and there's a way of sort of, enfolding national political sovereignty. Because I think about things like the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, right? Which is unbelievably powerful and important in ways that I think, certainly most Americans have no idea. They hear about the Eurozone crisis, this, that, and the other thing, but they don't realize that there's sort of an ongoing generation of rules and laws out of the European Court of Justice that is incredibly important for, again, day-to-day European life. And so I'd really like to see a more sort of visible and transparent version of democratic legitimacy. On the kind of the Franco-German question is incredibly important because I think that a lot of Europe's malaise is in part due to the complete, it's sort of like where's Waldo when it comes to France, right? I mean, it's just a complete kind of drop-off. When you think about the importance of, say, Kohl and Mitterrand working together, and then Sarkozy, Hollande, et cetera, it's like there's no there.
And do you think this is a problem specific to Hollande and
well, that's a great question, and we'll see, right? Because Macron obviously presents this very strong alternative, and so Angela Merkel has been sort of trying to sort of work on her own, completely absent the sort of historic role that France has played in moving forward European integration. And so, again, these really are the winds of change, and we'll have to see what happens.
I know we're doing the exact thing we shouldn't be doing as a panel, which is that instead of letting more people ask questions, we're just sort of all jumping on the first question. But look, I'm about as European as it gets. My parents are Polish, more or less. Originally, I grew up in Germany. I went to college in England. I've lived in Italy and France. I don't think that more European integration at this point is a wise idea. And I agree with you that there's a real democratic deficit in Brussels. I agree with you that there's real institutional reforms that would be necessary. But I just think that it's very difficult to explain that and sell that. And that what people are really feeling is that there's too much Europe and that we're trying to send a signal to European politicians that the solution is not giving away more sovereignty. And I also just think it's not going to work on a practical level. If you want to have more European integration, you have to have a consensus of now 26 countries, or you do a multi-speed complicated thing. But if it's really an EU reform that involves some amount of giving up sovereignty, you need 26 countries on board. And with Hungary and Poland on the one side, and the true Finns in government in Finland, and Syriza in power in Greece, and whatever the Italian election is going to bring, you're never going to get 26 countries. You just won't.
I have to respond really quickly. So I'm not saying more European
See what he did there? First he tried to tell you not to respond.
No. I'm allowed now. So that won't work. I'm not at all saying more European integration in terms of institutions and a more federal Europe and everything like that. What I'm talking about is more honesty.
Sure.
More honesty in terms of exactly what is involved in the institutions that are already in existence, right? I mean, I think the Eurozone itself, for example, but, across the board. So I'm really asking for a change in political culture in the way both national elites and European elites talk about what Europe is, which also is not easy, but.
Agreed.
All right, it's your turn at last.
Hello, my name is Andrew Hanna. I'm a reporter with Politico. So even if Mr. Wilders doesn't make it into the government, he clearly made some gains in this election, has an enhanced voice in Dutch politics. I just wanted to ask all the panelists what you saw as the future of his party and his position in Dutch politics going forward. Will he be a major oppositional voice if the other parties join the coalition? Or, how does this game out?
I'll go first. So I think because he's been getting conflated with Trump and the Brexiteers, I think a lot of American observers have the sense that Wilders is a relatively new force in Dutch politics.
Right.
He's been around for a while. He started his party 15 years ago. He was in parliament for a number of years before that as a PVV member. So if he gets 19 seats today, that's 5 fewer than he got in 2010. My expectation would be that he will continue to be what he is now, a representative for a sizable but limited base of say 10-15% of the population whose sole or at least overwhelmingly most important issue is immigration and the role of Islam in Dutch society. And so I imagine that it will continue to be that way. I don't know if the panelists.
Maybe I agree with Stan. First, it's not a party, so you can't become a member. It only has one member, and that's Geert Wilders himself. And you can't vote. I mean, there's no transparency in its funding. It's not a party. But he has a few seats in parliament, less than he had in 2010. He will remain a strong voice, but you've also seen that part of his agenda has been incorporated by CDA and VVD. Let me give 2 examples. Buma, the party leader of CDA, said that he's against dual citizenship, and if anybody has 2 passports, you have to hand in one. Well, I think here in this room there are a lot of people probably with 2 passports. I think why do you have to force somebody to make a choice between your father and your mother? So that was very strict. CDA. VVD, the party leader, the Prime Minister Rutte, said, in the Netherlands, we celebrate Christmas. Well, sorry. We have dinner with Christmas, and some people, of course, celebrate Christmas. But a lot of people have different religious or non-religion background. But a statement like that, as a prime minister, I think it was unheard 10 years ago. And it's also a bit hypocrite because at the same time Rutte says to people who have a Muslim background, you should lower your voice on religion. And then he says, we celebrate Christmas. So his agenda has been incorporated by VVD and CDA as well.
Exactly.
That's right. Let's go. We're going to continue on the back row, and then we're going to come forward.
Yeah, just building off on what you said, because just checking my phone already, I can tell what the headlines are going to be. Populism was stopped in the Netherlands. Dutch reject populism. But have they really rejected populism based on the fact that the VVD and CDA have adapted so much of the Wilders platform? And also, if this Forum for Democracy party gets in, Wilders was competing against 3 other mini right-wing parties. So I'm not so clear that it really wasn't a rejection of populism.
So perhaps I can speak to it. I think it's important. We're all suddenly focused on this. I've been thinking about populism a long time, so I'm a little jaded by now. But there's this sort of tendency to overinterpret every result, right? So when populists win in the United States and in Britain, I think there's a really significant chunk of the population and of political elites that are starting to say, oh, look, everything about this political order was terrible all along, and we need to get rid of it. And finally we get to say, how horrible these liberal elites are, and, let's give up on our values and so on. And there's a definite tendency in this town, for I've been heartened to see not as much in this building as one might have feared, but certainly in other parts of this town, to do that and say, well, we're all Trumpists now, right? That's one danger. Then there's the other danger of pointing to some of the good signs and saying, oh, look, we can go back to not worrying at all, right? So when in Austria, Hofer got 47.5% of the vote, suddenly this is a great victory for liberal democracy, that there's no more danger because the not quite fascist, only got 47.5 rather than 50.2%, right? I think both of those are over-interpretations, and I would say that for today as well. I think Stan is right that Wilders is going to continue playing a role. We have seen over time, over a 30, 40-year time period, the rise of populism. This didn't happen yesterday. It didn't even just happen because of 2008. It's been going on for a long time in a relatively monotonic rise. I think we need to really think seriously about the structural drivers of that and try to counteract some of those structural drivers and not sort of overinterpret every last election results. Populism is a generational challenge. We have to meet people's anger, not by giving up on our values, but by figuring out how to deliver for them in a way that gets them to embrace our deepest values, and perhaps with some concessions on certain things, but principled concessions. And we have to make sure that people's living standards rise again. We've seen in the post-war period a very rapid growth of living standards for people. We've seen over the last 20, 25 years a stagnation of living standards for a lot of people in a lot of countries. And that's one of the big drivers. So let's think carefully about actual political responses that take the situation seriously, but let's not overinterpret every last election result.
I think that's fair. Let's go over here. Let's wait for the mic. Here you go, 2 mics.
No, don't worry, I don't need that much time. A relatively difficult question, I think. We've talked about the structural issues between the vote in the Netherlands and the view of the European Union. I think migration being such a big issue in many nations in Europe right now, the one thing that the European Union could do to reinforce its own position in any of these countries is to come up with a very legitimate, strong answer on the migration question, whether it's one way or another. Is there any scope for that?
Well, I think the current policy is to help make Erdogan the absolute dictator of Turkey, and then hope that he keeps refugee flows to a minimum. I don't know if any of the panelists have suggestions for other potential policy solutions.
I'll happily take the people who are fleeing from Erdogan. I think that every European country would be deeply enhanced by the wonderful Turkish intellectuals who are trying to resist Erdogan, and if he does manage to become official dictator for life of Turkey, then we should welcome those people with open arms. All right, with this piece of gallows humor, I think, Kate, were you jumping in on this?
Well, so the way I sort of think about, it's a very good point. You're absolutely right. And so then that raises the question of why hasn't the EU been able to respond in a more functional, effective way, right? And the way I think about the European Union across a lot of the different policy areas is that it's plagued by what I call incomplete political development. And when I think through the sort of vast history of different polities rising and falling over time, because I do put the EU in the sort of long line of, the Hanseatic League, the Italian city-states, the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of the nation-state, the EU. I mean, we have to think about it as an innovative political form that may, in fact, be in the dustbin of history, as the Hanseatic League was, right? But if you look historically at things like control over borders, control over movement of people, the development of the passport, et cetera, these things tended to happen within very intense political situations, often involving war fighting and the need to respond to existential crises, right? So in fact, currency, the EU is the only currency union that has not come about as part of a larger state-building project that involves war fighting. There were a couple other ones, the Latin Currency Union and the Scandinavian Currency Union. They both fell apart, right, because of this incomplete political development thing, right? And so you would think that the immigration crisis would be such a pressing, crisis that the EU should respond. But I think that, unfortunately, historically, we have seen that the political space needed to really create a serious external boundary and so on really has not actually come to pass, right? And you see this across all these different, we have the currency, but we don't have a fiscal union, for example. Fiscal unions were created with national currencies, again, as part of war fighting, right? So I admire the European Union because it's a voluntary coming together of a polity, which historically is astonishing, right? But at the same time, that voluntaristic, legalistic, institutional, peacetime coming together has also left the EU without the kinds of tools, right? And part of that is this sort of, they don't have a fervent European identity, right? And that has actually created all kinds of problems. So unsurprisingly, the EU is in fact seeing those problems really become serious issues.
I don't think that the EU will come up with an answer on migration, simply because the EU, the member states don't agree. At the same time, let's also not underestimate what's happening already. I think the EU is, of course, hosting more refugees than Trudeau and Canada. Canada was doing big stuff in the media, but so in terms of numbers, the EU is doing a lot, but somehow the member states didn't agree to share the burden, not through a European solution. But a lot of member states are doing a lot of stuff in migration. I think the political wind will be that the labor internal migration, so the free movement of people in the EU, I think there we will see a little bit more restrictions. Yeah. At least that's how I read the political mood in the Netherlands and also in some other countries.
I mean, in a way, you don't need a European solution because eventually countries are going to close for. In a way, I think the rhetoric and the reality are very different here, right? The reality is that at this point, Merkel has done a complete U-turn. As Stan alluded to, we're basically outsourcing the job of keeping refugees out of Europe to Turkey and tolerating a lot of terrible things going on in Turkey because we really don't want the deal to fall apart. And not having an open conversation about that in any of the European, not just politicians, but the European public sphere, completely put under the carpet, right? But that's what the future of European policy is going to be like. You'll have a fortress Europe, I think. Merkel sort of heroically semi-died on the sword, and now she's sort of carefully removed the sword and is stanching the wound. And she's going to be very careful around swords in the future. So will other European leaders.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Let's go to that side of the room.
Hi, my name is JT Stanley. I'm a student at the University of Maryland. Dankjewel for coming and speaking to us today. My question is on where multiculturalism is going. There is obviously a section that is very Islamophobic or xenophobic. And the counter-reaction to that is a sort of blanket cultural relativism. And you've had others that have tried to walk a line saying there are implications, there are ramifications from fundamentalism in the Abrahamic religions. I wanted to know where you guys thought that sort of debate was going and where the population was ultimately going to move on that, because I feel like that conversation has not really been well vetted in the public discourse.
Are you wearing one of those nice Dutch-American flag lapel pins? I lost mine. I see there's some embassy staff here, and I would appreciate a new one. The future of multiculturalism, what do you guys think?
Let's take a swing at that.
I'll take a stab at it. Based on my experience there, you have to look, like everything, you have to look at the history and the history of the Netherlands. We all know about Indonesians and how they got there. We all know about the Surinamese and how they got there. And we all know how the Moroccans and Turks were imported to come work there. And they have assimilated, integrated. They built mosques. And so there's a very, very good, solid multicultural society there that is something that the Dutch are very proud of. However, we all have seen now that there's a lot of friction. Mr. Wilders has taken the mantle of going after the Moroccans and accusing them of committing all the crimes and that they're responsible for all the criminal behavior in the country, and to some extent the Turks too. So you now have this beautiful multicultural society that is dividing and is disagreeing. One of the things I did as ambassador was I used to invite young people over to my residence from all different parts of society. Dutch, historically Dutch people, Indonesians, Moroccans, Turks, and just ask them, what are their issues? What are their problems? What things do they encounter every day in school or at work or whatever? And it was shocking, but not surprising given what's going on. Those who came from either first, second, third, fourth generation Moroccan Turks, they don't call themselves Dutch. They have a Dutch passport. They're Dutch citizens. They've been living in the Netherlands, educated in the Netherlands, born in the Netherlands, but they call themselves Moroccans or Turks. They don't call themselves Dutch. And a lot of it has to do with they feel disenfranchised. They feel like they've been separated at school, at work, and that's a real problem in the Netherlands. And so they don't say, I'm Dutch. So I spent a lot of time trying to encourage them because one of the things an ambassador is supposed to do is try to spread the word about American values. And so I was trying to convince them that they should be proud to be Dutch. This is where they were born. This is where their families started. This is where their parents came. They immigrated from Morocco and Turkey, and they came here and they settled here. So you should be proud to be Dutch and wear that Dutch flag proudly. But obviously your roots, you're Moroccan and Turk originally, but you're Dutch. So I was constantly trying to infuse that over there. I don't think I succeeded, but it was something I was trying to do. But that's just one observation that I left with that I found really, really unfortunate. Because on the other hand, the Indonesians and the Surinamese who have come there, they're proudly Dutch. And it's wonderful. So I think it may be a matter of time, maybe another generation of Moroccans and Turks before they actually adopt that pride and really can say that they are proudly Dutch. But in terms of the future of multiculturalism, which is your question, I think, notwithstanding what's going on with Mr. Wilders and others, I do think that the Dutch, let's face it, they pride themselves on being a trading country and on being an open country and being a tolerant country, whether it's religion or culture or gender or sexual preference, whatever it is, they pride themselves on being tolerant. And I believe that's going to continue. I think that's part of their DNA, just like trade and water management. But I do think that will continue. I'm very optimistic about it.
I want to pick up on that, and I think I may be a little more pessimistic. I share the basic analysis. I was looking at a poll, because I'm writing that part of my book at the moment, thinking about sort of what I'm calling the rebellion against pluralism or the difficulty of a multi-ethnic society. 25 years ago in Germany, there was a poll. Somebody who's born and raised in Germany to Turkish parents. Do you consider themselves more German or more Turkish? So there's a couple of weird things here, right? The first is the question. I don't think an American pollster would say, study a bunch of people who emigrated here 30 years ago from China and say, are you more American or more Chinese? Which is not how they would put the question, because it makes the two seem mutually exclusive. But the point is that only 36% of Germans said this person is more German, right? So most people did not think of this person born and raised in Germany as German. This is 25 years ago. They reran the poll last year. What was the result? 36% of Germans thought this person was more German than Turkish. Wow. So it hasn't changed in a quarter century.
Interesting.
And it's a fundamental distinction. So my parents are Polish Jewish originally. I grew up in Germany. I have cousins not in the Netherlands, but in Denmark and Sweden and the United States. My German identity is very complicated. It's really not straightforward. My Danish and Swedish cousins, a little better, but not much. They do not say, I'm Danish, I'm Swedish, straightforwardly. I speak to my cousins who were born in the United States. I say, do you feel American? They look at me like I'm crazy. What do you mean? I am American. Do I feel American? What kind of question is that? Exactly. So European societies, not just the Netherlands, but other European societies have a fundamental problem with this. It's a fundamental problem. And I don't know how to change it. I will say this. We're doing a historically unique experiment here. The United States and Canada, for the many problems they have of their own, were born as countries of immigrants and to some multi-ethnic democracies. Not equal multi-ethnic democracies, but multi-ethnic democracies. European countries were not. It's not a complete coincidence that European democracies take hold after World War II, when thanks to genocide and the Holocaust and expulsions, they're as homogeneous as they've ever been. That is what democracy means in Europe. It is to have a mono-ethnic nation. And so then you have mass immigration, and these countries have to learn what it means to have a multi-ethnic democracy. And it's got to succeed because the alternatives are morally gruesome, But as a political scientist, I don't know that it can. I don't know that it can. I hope that it will. I don't see the alternative. But I think it's a real struggle. And I agree with you. I mean, you have a little bit, I think one part of your question we didn't address is about what's the model for this. And I think you're right, that on the one side, I'm going to sort of 3 or 4 models, right? On the far right, you have somebody who isn't ethnically descended from the same stock, just doesn't belong, will never belong. That's a significant portion of the population. Not a majority by any means, but that exists. Probably much larger portion of the population has a similar-ish version to that, which is, look, you know, if you just completely become like us, we'll probably treat you a little worse than the others, you know? But at least we'll pretend that we treat you the same. But that means you can't have any, you know, that means you have to celebrate Christmas. That means you have to basically integrate yourself into our national culture with no trace left. That, I think, is a large portion of the European population that believes that. And then on the left, there's a lot of people who go to the other extreme. People who believe in a form of multiculturalism, always depends on what you mean, that is abnegating of basic liberal values. That is saying that, you know, we should let communities govern themselves, and if they have forms of coercion and force within their own communities, that's no water of our back, because Western values are, you know, imperialist and so on, and we should forget about them anyway, right? And so that's a problem too. And then you have some immigrant communities, which in part because they've never been given a fair deal, they've never been actually offered full membership, are starting to turn to forms of particularism and so on, which are the sort of complement of that. And you see that with the election of the Denk guys, right? And so in the middle, there is the project of a liberal multi-ethnic society in which, yes, of course, you can celebrate your own religion. Yes, of course, you can see your cultures reflected in the country to which you've immigrated. But you also accept the basic liberal rules of a society. And I see the people who are fighting for that and the people who are accepting that embattled on 2 sides. But that's, I think, where the solution lies.
Can I maybe on the, because part of the answer of this multicultural dialogue will happen in Dutch Parliament. And so we have these 3 seats now for Denk. We have the Orthodox Christian in Parliament. We have the cosmopolitans. We have the, so, you know, it will be very interesting. And I think the Netherlands can definitely learn from the US much more about the story of your own country. We've been a bit modest on it. Some people are, let's say, still backward looking. I'm convinced that the culture and the society is not a static thing. It will change, and I think we will get there. But we've been looking away a little bit too much, not aware of the problems. But these times are over. And in that sense, these 3 seats for Denk are a positive thing, because that debate will happen in Parliament as of next week.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. I think Usher is staying on.
Yes, it was the body language. So he's the guy who lost, big time. And I was looking to his body language, whether he was going to resign, and his body language is very sad. But I'm not very good at dubbing, so he's staying on.
I think he's staying on. So we're going to do one more question, then we have a reception outside, and we'll turn on the sound.
He doesn't have to resign.
He doesn't have to?
No. No, now he can lead the Labour Party to its research.
It's a great trend of Labour parties to...
No, I don't mean it.
He's going to do the same as the Christian Democrats. Just do a holiday, don't take any responsibility, and then win the elections.
Oh, for
years
sure.
from now.
Yeah. No, yeah, eventually. No, for sure. We're going to give is there anyone who's not asked a question before? Yep, right here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Vandenberg from the World Bank. Not sure if it's working. Yeah, now it is. I want to ask a little bit about the results of these elections and the traces, well, the populist that is there, the problems with immigrants and the multicultural struggling that is now going to happen and is on the rise, and what it would also do with the integration of the Balkan. Because the EU one of the key functions of the EU in the 90s and early 2000s was also the stabilization of Eastern Europe, and it was extremely successful in that and also brought a lot of economic prosperity. But now with populism being integrated in all the parties and a lot of parties focusing and governments going to focus on own country first, this is already having quite a negative effect on the Balkan. And this can only become worse and will open up, obviously, a lot of possibilities for Putin to further meddle in what they already did in Macedonia, what they are doing in Serbia, what they're trying to do in Kosovo. So I wanted to ask a little bit how you would see any path moving forward to actually continue on an integration path for what is a very difficult set of countries in a political and landscape and also an economic landscape where there is very little appetite for that.
You want to go first, Kate?
Yeah, you saw me sort of grimace because I think you've answered your question essentially, unfortunately. I mean, I think, one of the really unfortunate negative externalities of all of this, both on the US side and the European side, is this sort of inward focus and this inability to kind of project power in a positive sense diplomatically in the world. And that's certainly, how I would think about the Trump presidency as well as really, a really frightening time for all these different areas in the world that really could use positive American leadership and certainly European as well. Anyone more cheerful?
I represent Macedonia, Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, also on the board of the World Bank, Montenegro, and it's not easy. Maybe I hope we have learned a little bit, and in the sense that maybe the enlargement discussion with Bulgaria and with Romania and other new member states were too much driven from an economic point of view and with an economic perspective. And hopefully we are better in not only bringing money, grant money, but also the carrot and the stick also on the governance issues. I hope. I'm not sure.
Well, on that extraordinarily optimistic note, I want to thank the panelists for their time, and I want to thank you all for coming. And some of you will be pleased by these results. Others will be,
I'm
deeply.
going to drink
Yeah,
tonight.
that's right. All right, so let's do that. All right.
Beste